need to. I'll also check the chat box to see if you're asking any questions that need to be urgently answered. I'll also stop periodically and ask if there are any questions. It'll be recorded and posted on the website, and all you have to do is click on the link. At the conclusion of the webinar, I'll send out all of the information and a couple of different resources for you that we found to be useful. So if we could just go around for the people that are online right now, if you could say your name, where you're from, and then what your top 2 things you want to gain from this webinar, I'd be very appreciative. So if we could start with Carla.
Sure. This is Carla Lewis from Serve Center, and we're working with both the ESEP and CSEP I3 projects. So I'm just kind of here to learn more about the early alert system.
Thank you. How about Monica?
State College. This is a 2-year community college in Mansfield, Ohio, and I'm calling to learn a little bit more about how we may be able to enhance our alert process.
Hi, Monica. I'm not too far away from you, so welcome. It says New York Early College. Sarah?
Hi, this is Sarah Hooker. I'm with JFF. I'm working on documentation of our various I3 grants on early college, and so also just excited to listen and learn about what is happening in Columbus State and think about ideas for future documentation.
Thanks, Sarah. Tiffany.
Hello, this is Tiffany Troop. I'm calling from Fayetteville Technical Community College, and I'm just joining to learn more about early alert systems.
Well, thanks, everybody. Right now, the group is pretty small, so at any time, if you have a question or if something doesn't make sense or if you want to know more information, please feel free to jump in, and we'll go ahead and address those questions as they come along. I'm pretty easygoing, so it won't bother me one single bit. I do have to apologize. I'm sitting in the lobby of a hospital, so if you hear the announcements, I apologize for that. It doesn't happen very frequently, but it is happening right now.
Pre-hospital, PTA, triple alert, PTA, 4 minutes, ER, part-time B3.
So let's go ahead and get started. When we look at the quality of a school's learning community, we measure it based on how effectively we address the needs of the individual student. Do you disagree or agree with this particular statement? How do you feel about measuring effectiveness by how well a school addresses the needs of struggling students? So this is open for anyone. Well, in some cases, what we hear from people is that, you know, the school is measured by the overall effect that it has on the group of students who participate. So we have things like state report cards. I know that when we look at the state report card in Ohio, a lot of people value the effectiveness of a school by whether or not it has a good score on the state report card. But that doesn't necessarily tell us how well a school might do with students who struggle. You could have a large number of students who don't struggle who compensate by data over those who do struggle, and it might not give a true picture. And so I put statements like this up to help us to think about what really is our role as both an intermediary, a high school, and a community college or a four-year college with regard to making sure that our quality is such that we carry both the students who are academically able and the students who struggle as individuals rather than aggregates in the overall statistical analysis of the school. When we look at college ready, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. College ready could be that they finished high school. College ready could be that they finished high school and are ready to go to a 2 or 4 year institution of higher education without remediation. College ready could be that the student could in some form or fashion enter into a program for a credential. So there's lots of definitions of what is college ready. In general, for an early college, we're looking at the ability for a student to enter into a collegiate environment, either 2 or 4 year, without remediation. But we also hear about what is career ready. Again, career ready could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But here we're looking at, are the students, when they exit the program that they're currently in, let's say it's high school, are they ready to be economically viable for the development of themselves and their family upon exit of school, whether it be the exit of high school or the exit of a 2 year or a 4 year college?
You guys want to come on back?
Sorry.
Getting you on full time.
So what does college and career ready mean together? There are lots of different measures, lots of different ways of looking at it. But what we want to make sure that we do is that we allow or enable students to go beyond a low skill level threshold of employment and economic sustainability. So we don't want to separate college ready and career ready completely from each other, because then we're not producing the opportunities for students to be economically sustainable. So in most cases for early colleges that we've worked with or that I've worked with, and most that I have viewed, we want to make sure that we're doing a combination of both the career and the college ready. But here's where the kicker is. It matters most what the definitions are for the school community. So if I'm in an early college high school and I haven't defined what we exactly mean as college ready and what we exactly mean as career ready, then it may be random what it is that we produce. So a key element to the really good opportunities for students is that we're very clear about what it is that we want or what it is that we expect for our students, and we know that everybody in our local community, the parents, the businesses, the community college, we're all working towards something that we know is observable and measurable and that we've agreed upon. So if I could ask Monica, do you guys have a definition for college and career ready where you are?
I don't have that at my fingertips, but typically we look at students who are college ready as not being required or needing to take any foundational or developmental coursework. So they place into college level math and or reading, and or English.
And as an early college, do you have that expectation prior to exit of high school? What are your expectations with regard to participation in college coursework prior to exit of high school?
Yes, and so they would have to take a placement assessment test. We use the AccuPlacer, and they do have to be college level in the reading section.
And thank you very much. And that's fairly typical for most early colleges. The dilemma that we have in I3 when we're initiating early college is that if the school community doesn't have a really deep understanding of the attributes that go together to make the college ready standard, let's say by AccuPlacer, then at times we may have students who may fall through the cracks and they don't know what it is that they're expected to do. They don't know what the level of rigor is. They don't know what the level of performance in mathematics, as an example, might be. So when we have tools available to us, we should use them. And all those tools together can go into an alert system that can help us to predict what needs to be done for students as we go along. In the state of Ohio, and I'm sure that it's similar in New York and in other states, there are minimum benchmarks that they use for remediation-free scores if they're using something like the SAT or the ACT. So when we look at the SAT and the ACT, we're looking at what it would take for a student to be able to be placed without remediation into English, math, sometimes science is a combination of English and math. What we need to do, however, is be able to predict what the placement would be prior to the 11th grade in our early college system. So if we use what just the state guidelines are and don't have a plan for and an agreement for what those earlier indicators are, then the kids, again, would find that they would be in jeopardy because they're not able to place at those standards. I believe in New York you have Regents exams. Is that correct, New York? Oh, they're not, I'm not hearing them. In Ohio, we have end-of-course exams, and I'm sure across the country that's pretty common or typical nowadays in the high schools. So we know we have those available to us, but are they enough for us to be able to use to predict remediation-free status? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. In the state of Ohio, as an example, the level at which the student performs in something, let's say it's English 1 or English 2 exam, is not necessarily the level at which we would say with assurance that a student could perform in a college class. So for instance, if a student was scored proficient in English 1, what does that tell us about their college readiness? Not as much as we would like, unfortunately. So the diagnostics aren't available on those big ticket tests for us to be able to use. So when we look at high schools and we look at what's going on in high schools, a robust system that enables us to be able to see how students are doing and what needs to be done is really helpful. If we look at what's going on in most of our high schools when we begin the I3 work, or even in our regular comprehensive high schools, we know that there's a need to improve retention, success, and completion for college coursework. In Ohio, it's called the College Credit Plus program, but we do know that students, if left at their own devices, are not going to necessarily all perform well, and that we have really no information to improve, no information about how those students who were able to be successful, how they did it. There's little or no existing all-student early alert progress survey information. Paper surveys are available for specific programs like the beginning of our I3, but there isn't really a system-wide early alert or progress survey for students. We know that in our schools we tend to have, at least in Ohio, a high student-to-counselor ratio, so intervening with students, if we expect that the counselor is going to be able to intervene with students based on their progress, that's probably not going to work very well. And we know that there's very little to no case management for non-identified, meaning they don't have an IEP or they're not identified as English language learners. There's relatively little case management, so there's not anybody keeping their eye on the prize, so to speak, for students who struggle but are not identified. We also find that there's a need for student success and support programs, and that we need to set equity goals so that we make sure that we help to progress students without the barriers that may cause inadvertent inability to access opportunity. And then we also know that some of our existing systems and processes tend to promote inequity of opportunity. For instance, here we're looking at some of our honor systems. If you don't join an algebra class in the 8th grade or you don't take an honors course, it becomes significantly more unlikely that you would ever participate in anything beyond Algebra 2. So we know that these things are happening. What is it that we can do to design something that could be better? Many of you may be familiar with response to intervention, and in Ohio it's something that is part of the Ohio improvement process. It's suggested for every school, regardless of grade level. RTI has taken off pretty big in elementary buildings and middle schools, but not so much in the high school. But what an RTI, response to intervention model, when we're looking at college readiness, what it should do is be able to give students one or more research-validated interventions. For I3, that is primary, because what we're doing in our I3 work is we're implementing interventions across the board that have had a high likelihood of success for kids to transition into and matriculate through college coursework. In RTI, the student's academic progress is monitored frequently, and we track those interventions so that we can be more efficient and effective for the students. And if they fail to show improved academic skills despite the designed and implemented intervention, then we can look and see if there's further testing or need for testing for underlying learning disabilities or other learning problems. Is anybody unfamiliar with any of these? So if you could say, yes, I'm familiar with it, or no, I'm not, and then I can know how to gauge the next step.
So this is Tiffany. No, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Carla or Monica? Gina?
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with it in the college ready context.
Okay. How are you doing, Gina? Well, I'll go forward with some more information about that. To intervene early and meet the needs of struggling learners, we want to map instructional strategies. So our target for I3 regarding early alert systems in high school coursework. So I'm going to go high school coursework first, and then I'll talk about how we're integrating between the college and the high school to be able to make a seamless system. So if we just look at a normal curve with the 100 being in the middle, our achievement tests are looking at about, do you see where the red dot is? I'll circle it for you. So this is where achievement, right here is where achievement tests are looking. We have this whole range here of students who are what we would say is typically academically able students who may or may not be college ready, and then we have our academically able students, again, who are who could overperform or perform above the remainder of the crew in here that also are not necessarily college ready. So by just using the achievement test alone, we aren't going to get enough information to be able to help to determine what to do for students. Because again, if this is proficient in an achievement test where this red dot is, then we have these students and we have these students. Do we really know what it means, what the information is about college readiness from that? The answer is we know an indicator of a trend, but we don't necessarily know if they're college ready from just that assessment alone. The way that RTI is set up in our schools that we're working with in Central Ohio is that there are 3 tiers of intervention available for students. When we look at Tier 1 would be a universal intervention. So with regard to I3, this would be the common instructional framework. Those are universal interventions that are put in place, highly researched, put in place to specifically gain or garner outcomes that are related to I3, which is college access. So a universal intervention could also be something that's put in regarding a trend. So let's say that we looked at demographic. If we look at the demographic of a student that has entered school, is probably a BC student, and we look at all of the BC students in the 9th grade as an example, what are some trends about their academic performances in English or in math that cause us to think that something might be awry in either their prior preparation, or in their current understanding? So we might put in something like Math Design Collaborative as a universal intervention that's targeting a specific area of mathematics so that we can close those gaps. Oh, and then for some of you, if you are unfamiliar with I3, it's Investing in Innovation. It's a federal grant that the people in the community of practice are using the funds to provide the opportunity for students to become college ready and access college coursework prior to exit of high school. Our goal is for 60% of the kids to have 12 or more credit hours in Central Ohio, and 90% of the students to exit with college coursework and or a credential from an accredited institution that is in the economic drivers for our Central Ohio region. So I'm sorry I didn't say that earlier, and I did get a nice message to remember to explain that, so I apologize. Now back to the regularly scheduled show. I think I'm funny, but I'm not, but if you guys chuckle in your head, I'll feel good. All right, so Tier 1 is the universal intervention. Again, these are things that research says are going to work well for students with the goals that you have in mind, but these are also things that you could put in as a trend. So if you're finding that students are demonstrating a difficulty with order of operations, and you want to use the Math Design Collaborative formative assessment lessons for order of operations, putting that in would be a universal intervention based on trends for the larger group. For Tier 2, that's where we go to more individualized intervention. So for the teacher inside of the classroom who needs, if some of the students need more support than their peers, then the teacher is responsible inside of the regular classroom to differentiate for that student. So that could look like, so I'll keep with math if that's okay, because that's what I used to teach. So let's say that I'm in my math classroom and I'm finding that I have 4 students who are having a tough time with order of operations, but the rest of the kids are doing pretty well. I can formulate my classroom strategies to promote or enrich the students who already understand it, and then work more individually with the students, the 4, 5, or 6, who are having trouble or have misconceptions about the order of operations, so then we can move on to the next concept. So Tier 2 is about differentiating, providing small group interventions, sometimes individual interventions, inside the regular classroom. When we get to Tier 3, we've already tried universal interventions, we've already done some individualized interventions, we've tracked them over time, the students over time, and we find that their needs are greater than what we may see for the typical students inside the classroom. So here's where we need to start to implement some things called wraparound services. That's what we call them in I3. These are services that may be coming from the outside. It may be a redefinition of the system or the structures in which the students experience their instruction. An example here from mathematics would be for a student who has had Tier 1 and Tier 2 interventions, they're struggling, and we're finding at the mid-year mark that they're behind the remainder of their peers inside of the classroom. We may put in a tutoring opportunity for the students during their study hall. and that tutoring would be targeting specifically the things that cause them to demonstrate below grade level behaviors, or not behaviors, I'm sorry, below grade level academics, or it may be something that they had a misconception that really is deep and they needed to work a little bit harder on helping that student to overcome that misconception. When we look at college readiness, when it's applied to an individual student, I gave you some examples. I have some more, but these are usually done with more robust data sets than just the teacher's casual observation. So when we look at Tier 1 intervention and Tier 2 intervention, Tier 3 intervention, we need to make sure that we're keeping some track of it. And so here's where alert systems become more necessary. I'm going to skip the individual and go to the process part. So we call the beginning of year assessment, so BOY stands for beginning of year assessment, whatever assessment is available to help estimate what the skill gap might be for a student. So it tells where they are and what their level of proficiency is. If we use only the state data that comes from the state testing system, we're going to have enough information to be able to assess where a student is, because those tend to be given at the end of the school year. So we might see where they were for the last school year, but we might not know where they are for this current school year. And it might not come in time if you're in the state of Ohio. So what we want to try to do is to use something that can help us to see what the gap is between what's expected for the student and where they need to perform typically. So the first thing that you want to do to set up your RTI system is figure out how to assess and estimate the skill gaps for any given student. I'm going to show you this example. This is an example of a real class, and I checked mathematics. This particular school used a product called NWEA MAP, which is measure of academic progress, which tells where a student is compared to all other students. So if you look across the bottom, so I'll get my little pen out. If you look across the bottom, across here, where I drew the line, that's measuring the academic performance compared to all other students that took that assessment at that grade level. So for this particular grouping of students, the academic achievement in percentile goes from 0 to 100. Along the other side, and I'll change my little pen color. Maybe I'll change my little pen color. Nope, keeping it the same. But if we're going up in a not very straight line, from 0 to 100 is their conditional growth percentile. This is where the student is more individually examined. So when we look at achievement going across the bottom, we're looking at the performance of that student compared to all other students who took that particular assessment with regard to achievement. When we look at the growth, and I would suggest that it's important for all of our schools to look at growth. When we're looking at growth, we're looking at the individual's performance against themselves over time. So they're looking at the capacity to be able to grow from one to the next.
Marcy, I can't hear you. I don't know if everyone else can.
I can't hear either.
Yep. Thanks, Sarah. I can't hear either.
Okay. I think it's probably something wrong with her mic. If you guys would just bear with us for a few minutes, I'm going to give her a call on her cell. She's calling back in right now, you guys, so just hold tight. She got disconnected. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Caesar.
Back? Hi, everybody. Am I back?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
The call dropped. I apologize.
All right. Technology.
Well, I
Okay.
apologize to everyone.
No problem. Go ahead.
I'm going to go back to, should I go back a slide?
No, I think you were on the slide, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So when on this particular slide, we're looking at where students are in a particular classroom. This is a math classroom, and the math scores are shown. The students who are in the lower left quadrant, the ones who are in the 0 to 50th percentile of growth and 0 to 50th percentile in achievement, for those students, those are the ones that we're going to start off at the beginning of the year looking at it and assessing skill gaps. They have not shown that they have had growth over time, so they are a big concern because they're not necessarily meeting the academic growth goals that we would want for them. They're also not achieving typically with their peers, which would be above the 50th percentile. So in this particular case, in the beginning of the school year, I would look at the students that are circled in the red circle, plus the student that is just above them in the gold, so above and in the gold. I would look at those students for Tier 2 interventions from the beginning of the school year. And in NWEA MAP, and so the same is true in STAR, you can see their actual zone of proximal learning, so where they're starting. If the teacher compares where they're starting in the zone of proximal learning to the grade level, then they can see what gaps have to be closed. And that's the first thing that we want to do when we're looking at performance in RTI. We want to assess what the skill gap is or could be. Does anybody have any questions about what I'm talking about here? Okay, then we'll go ahead and go on. The next thing is to determine what the likely reasons are, or reasons are for the student's depressed academic performance. There can be several possible underlying reasons, and so it's really important that you look at as much data as you can. So here we're going to look at, is it a skill deficit, Are there fragile skills, meaning they possess the skills but are not necessarily fluent and automatic in their use, or is it a performance or motivation deficit? So here's where the teacher has to have a relationship with the student for the alert system to start working. So the teacher's going to look at observationally what is causing the issue for the student, what is it that she or he needs to do to close that gap, and then to make sure that they're impacting it for whatever is causal. It's at the end, you're interested, I have a series of different ways that teachers can look for what a skill deficit is, what a fragile skill is, and what a performance or motivation deficit is. I'll give you an example really quick. If a student comes in and they don't know how to move the X to the other side of the equal sign, they've never done that, they don't know how to do it, they didn't know to do it, then that would be a skill deficit. But if the student could do it sometimes and not others, then that might be a fragile skill. If the student just doesn't want to do any schoolwork, then of course that's a motivation deficit. So we want to make sure that we're addressing the gaps in the area in which the highest likelihood of closing the gap would occur. Does anybody have any questions about that one? The next thing would be to select a scientifically based intervention likely to improve the student's academic functioning. Now here, we're talking about a Tier 2 intervention for an individual student. We use Tier 1 interventions for trends, for things that we want to have the entire group have experience and exposure to. In a Tier 2 intervention, we want to make sure that we're looking at specifically what a group needs to have that's either different or in addition to what it is that happens in the regular ed classroom. We don't have time for students to be experimented on, so generally we target those things that we know that research already puts in place. So let's say that we have a universal implementation of literacy groups in a social studies classroom. So that's one of the things that we use in the common instructional framework is literacy groups. It'd be a universal implementation because we know that we get gap closing when that occurs. Now we have a student who's in a literacy group but is having a tough time understanding what it is that they need to do in order to be able to read a primary document, something that had an authorship of, let's say, someone in the late 1800s. So if the student is having difficulty accessing the text, it's going to be hard for them to be able to move forward. So we might use something like Achieve 3000 as a tool that can give them text at their reading level so that they can access the information, but also still work from their zone of proximal learning to go above that, their zone, in order to be able to perform at grade level, so that the teacher would know what is expected at the typical grade level and what is the student's current performance, and then how to close that gap. That would be a Tier 2 intervention put in for that particular student or a group of students, each demonstrating similar attributes. Once we have some things in place, we need to monitor the academic progress frequently and to evaluate the impact of the intervention. So let's take a different scenario in this particular case. Let's take a student who is academically a BC student, but on the NWEA MAP predictor, they did not score likely to be a 22 on the ACT in reading. So the ACT benchmark is already tied in NWEA MAP. So this is giving the teacher at the beginning of the school year an indicator of where the student is with regard to performance on ACT. So if that's the case, then what the teacher could do is look at the specific zone of proximal learning for that group, that student or that group of students, and start to do Tier 2 interventions for them toward college ready. So here's where we're looking at a student who is exhibiting gaps in college readiness because we have that definition, we know what those skills are, but they're not exhibiting it. So again, going through the steps, I'd look for the trend and figure out what the gap is. Then I'd look at what's causing the gap. Is it that they have a skill deficit? Is it that they have fragile skills, or is there a motivation issue that our relationship with the student could help to motivate them to perform? Then I'm going to look at what is it that we need to do in order to implement for that particular student. In this case, I might still use Achieve 3000, which is it's for those of you who don't know, it's a tool that gives nonfiction reading sources to students and encourages writing based on their zone of proximal learning or their entry point, and then it stretches them to slightly above that so that they can get some more practice and help in reading. So when we monitor the academic progress, we want to keep tabs on what's being done, who's doing it, and how often is that happening. So in this particular case for that student, we might put the information into their academic record. I'll just give two examples. In my last two schools where I was a principal, we used PowerSchool, and the one before that was Progress Book. And in each of those, we had an ability to do log entries. So we as a school said, here's our convention. When we have an intervention that we're putting in for a student, if it's Tier 1 or Tier 2 or Tier 3, we would mark it in as a log entry. So for that particular student, we might put in Tier 2 intervention as the title, and then I describe what it is that I did. I used Achieve 3000 to give nonfiction text to the student to be able to help and assist them in moving forward with their reading in my particular classroom. So there's lots of other ways to do it. I put some in here. It might be by observation. It might be by giving them mini tasks. It might be by giving them periodic assessments inside of the classroom, formative assessments, benchmarking assessments, lots of different ways to do it, but we need to start recording when we're doing things differently for students because of a demonstrated gap. Does anybody have any questions so far? It says call-in user 7 is speaking, but I'm not hearing them.
Marcy, you're actually user 7. You called in on a different line.
Oh, I called in on a different line. So I'm talking to myself,
right.
Everybody.
Right.
Okay, you can all laugh now. So I'll go ahead and go further. If you have, Tiffany, did you have something?
No, I don't.
Any of you, if there is anything, please jump in. I don't mind at all. My goal is to help you. Okay. So what do we have to do differently when we're looking at...
Thank you for calling. Your call and your time are both very important to us. Please know that we are doing our best to assist you.
Hello?
That's good. Go ahead, Marcy.
Okay.
Yeah, I had to mute someone. No problem.
So what can we do differently under the RTI model for early colleges? One is once you've selected your cohort, make sure that you're documenting Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions over time. For those of you in community colleges, this is very similar to what you might use if you use Starfish or another tracking tool. And most of the colleges that I've worked with do it electronically and have a pretty robust electronic system. I'll talk about Starfish here in a minute. We want to make sure that we are always using scientifically based interventions, the Common Instructional Framework as the universal intervention, and then breaking it down into more specific Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions after that are important. So the same kinds of things were happening at the college level with Columbus State Community College. So they had the same kinds of alert issues that we were having, and kids were falling through the cracks with regard to College Credit Plus. So they went with Starfish. they wanted to make sure that they had an influence on student behavior. They wanted to raise flags for students so that they didn't just keep pushing forward and then fall into a deep, dark crevice of a hole and not be able to get out, so that they can monitor attendance behavior and academic performance over time. Very similar to what I just described for the high school version. They wanted to make sure that there was a common communication tool. They wanted to make sure that they also could change their behavior as a flag. So here's where we start to see a few of the differences between what the high school would be doing and what the college would be doing. In the high school, we tend to need to go to a few more resources than just alerting a student that there's a problem. At times we have to call parents, we have to talk with a mentor that might be working with them, or a teacher who has a close relationship with a student. We tend to need to go beyond just alerting a student that there is an academic problem, that we need to go a little bit further and help to surround the student. That's why we say when we go to Tier 3 that we're looking at wraparound services. That means that we're wrapping around the student in as many areas, social, emotional, academic, sometimes physical ways as is possible. The college then started looking at flags, at a flag system, and how is it that they would be able to track students and student performances and the professor's concerns for those students. This is an example of the data that they started to collect. Any alert system also needs to have an influence on instruction. So if you're going to look at student performance, behavior, attendance, academic progress, it needs to be timely, and it needs to be in a cycle that could promote a change. If we only report, as an example, if we only report problems at the end of a term, there's really not any area of student efficacy toward a change for that particular grading period. So these need to be early and often. And the same thing became true in the collegiate environment with Starfish. So they created flags, kudos, and help me where the student can raise a flag, to-dos, and referrals. They designed surveys that were cognizant of content and timing for classes. They developed student communication tools, design services, and effective practice development and evaluation. So they went through robust training, very similar to what we did in the high school when we put in RTI. So now what we see is that we have, a student success network at the college and a student success opportunity called RTI in the high school, but are they talking to one another? So the next phase of work was needed to be, how can we get the information from one system to talk to another system for students who are concurrently enrolled in college coursework and high school coursework? So here's how we're looking at it here in Central Ohio. As the student is matriculating through high school or preliminary coursework to the college coursework, we're going to use RTI, and we're going to document the flags, the kudos, et cetera, in the student information system. Those would give us a red, yellow, and a green systems check for any student at any given time. One of the tools that one of the schools is using is called Learning Circles. So how do we circle around a student and make sure that everybody has the information that they need to close the gaps wherever they exist? The same thing was happening concurrently for kids who were in the college, but the college and the school were not talking to one another, or the systems were not talking to one another efficiently and effectively. So what we've created is a student success network that integrates the two, and we're right now in progress of, they're calling it permitting, but we're jumping the data from one system into the other system. So right now our early college student data from the college side is being transferred into the alert system at the high school. So we are looking at all of the flags, the kudos, the alerts for academic performance, the attendance issues are able to be seen real time in the high school system. Now, this hasn't been easy because we've had to map fields back and forth so that they have similar titles and they have the capacity to be able to be seen from one to the other. But that progress, we think, is going to help our students to not fall through the cracks. Since we do have systems that are aligned to ultimately wrapping around the student, we want to make sure that they talk to one another. And then when we have our systems on the school site side, then we have the ability to use a couple of different modes of intervention or systems intervention. So the first is that we have site teams, and those site teams would include the counselor, a teacher representative, administrator, if they have a business partner, somebody from the business side. They're looking overall, and an advisor from the college. They're looking at overall progress and trends to see if any universal research-based practices need to be implemented to help the students move forward faster. They're also there to talk about what it is that the school can do from a systems perspective to ease the communication gap that exists between the college and the school. In this case, we would have college representation from the career facilitator and the advisor with everybody who's planning what's happening inside of the school, and they meet monthly. They're able to then plan for and progress students a little bit more efficiently because of the amount of time that they're meeting. We want to make sure that there's a way for the students to be able to log, or for the teachers, the professors, the counselors, the advisors, to be able to log their information and be able to see it back and forth. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is an example where a student could log in and see that they need to have an appointment with a makeup test situation in the testing center. So we can communicate both electronically and in person with students with information that everyone can see. When we try really hard to be able to assist students, we also have to think about where some of the flexibilities that we're going to need to have. So for instance, if a student can't meet with a college professor, how are they going to alert the professor, and how are they going to have information going from the high school back to the college? So in that case, we have 2 liaisons per school who are monitoring the student success system on the high school side and giving information as needed to the college side. What we are not doing right now is transferring information back and forth. Right now, the main repository of information is residing in the high school. So we're kind of, we're looking at a main repository for data and information, an ability for systems to talk to one another, and then a real systemic way of diagnosing what's wrong or what is needed for each of the students. So right now, as we speak, in our college, our early college to be high schools, in our I3 grant, we're working on the ability to be able to use the RTI system both for students who are in high school and students who are in college, and having their data systems and platforms talk to one another so that we can monitor more efficiently and effectively the progress of a student over time. This isn't easy work. It's hours and hours and hours of data mapping and making sure that we understand what we mean when we say what is the skills gap, what kinds of interventions are available, how are we tracking interventions, how are you monitoring student performance, are you giving kudos, are you giving flags for academic issues, are you looking at behavior, are you looking at overall academic performance. All of these things together are influencing how we're moving forward, but it is a very, very worthwhile thing. So a little story. I was fortunate enough to start a STEM early college that was an affiliate of The Ohio State University here in Columbus, Ohio. And when we started that particular school, we didn't have a common understanding of what college ready meant. It took us a good year and a half of negotiations with math faculty and English language arts faculty and social studies faculty and science faculty for us to come up with what it was that students had to know and be able to do in order to be successful in individual entry-level classes. We planned backwards our curriculum to meet those particular needs. So here's an example. We were looking at the students who were entering into calculus at Ohio State University, calculus for science majors at Ohio State University. And the professors were saying the kids know trig, but they can't recall or determine what trig function to use immediately. They have to look around for it, or they have to be told what trig function to use. So that told us that we had a fragile skill deficit. So because we had a fragile skill deficit, we had to look back through our preparation schedule to see what was it that we were doing, how were we doing it, and could we close that particular skill deficit so that it wasn't a fragile system once they got into the college coursework. What we ended up doing is lining up our algebra and our Algebra 2 courses with trig. So instead of going algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and then taking trig after that, or not taking trig and trying to go to calculus straight on or pre-calculus straight on, we took the trig class and collapsed it into our algebra series. And then we put our algebra and our Algebra 2 classes right after each other. What ended up happening is that our students no longer exhibit the fragile skill of being able to demonstrate the use of trig functions when they got into their calculus classes. So the system worked really well, but it also took that collaborative effort with information from professors. We were able to see how they were doing at the university. At the same time, we were seeing how they were prepared from the high school. We looked at what it took to master the skills and the content, and then we planned backwards from that. That's really what a robust alert system should be able to do for you. That particular case was where we had a Tier 2 trend that we had to fix, but there are others that are even more global, and there are others that are even more specific. I'm going to turn it over to you guys to ask any questions that you might have, and then hopefully if you are interested, I can show you some more information. I will send this particular PowerPoint with the annotated information to each of you by email. So if I could ask, are there any questions? Gina, Carla, Sarah, and Tiffany, how are you feeling about the information? Is this information that you already knew? Has this been helpful for you?
This is Tiffany. I think it's great information. It's definitely been helpful.
Is there anything that you need further clarification for?
Not at this time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to conclude then, and when I send you the information, I know that this has been recorded and it'll be shared on the website. But I'll also include my contact information so that if you need any further assistance, I would be happy to help. We're working on it. It's not easy. It's not 100% in any situation, but I do know from experience that this does make a difference for kids, and we do get larger numbers of kids into higher level coursework much more quickly when we're purposeful like this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Marcy. I know you're in the hospital. Marcy's a real trooper. Her father's in emergency surgery, but she still wanted to do this. So we want to thank you a lot for continuing to go through this. So thanks a lot, Marcy.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm passionate about this work, and right now he's in surgery, so there really isn't anything for me to do for my family. So I get to share time with you guys, and you took my mind off of it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Our prayers are with you.
Thank you.
Marcy, it's really impressive work, and I look forward to learning more about it and talking with you more in the future.
Thanks, Sarah.
Everyone, this presentation will be on the community of practice, and that's kind of how you signed up for it. So if you have any questions, just feel free to send me an email. But the recording will be on, and additionally, Marcy will send you this presentation and the recording if you like. You know, so feel free to visit the website, the Community of Practice, and lots of materials and resources that are free for you to take advantage of. So everyone have a great evening and take care.
Thank you, Caesar.
Yeah.
You too. Thank you.